My last garden looked like this, with 4 simple raised beds in the backyard. And my current garden looks like this. Its footprint is larger than our house, and overall we have scaled up significantly. The problem is I scaled this up incorrectly, and the result is what you see here. Beds I didn't get to use, pathways without enough mulch, and seriously problematic weed pressure. When you've got big plans and you're excited to get going, it is really tempting to build everything out all at once. Believe me, I know, I just did it, but I'm going to actively encourage you not to do it. I'm going to show how I should have scaled this up in order to get the full benefit of the garden, in the hopes of convincing you not to repeat my mistakes. I'll give some short background on the full design, the basic principles of how I should have scaled it up over time, and then go deep with a specific scaling plan of what I should have built out in the garden and when. Starting with the overall design, if you have been following this video series about growing food in the suburbs, you know I have some big ambitions for this site. Those include no longer buying any of our salad greens like kale, arugula, chard, or lettuce. The fruits we buy most often, like berries, apples, and pears, along with some nuts. And I would love to no longer buy the brassicas we tend to eat a lot of, such as broccoli and Brussels sprouts. I would love to raise our own eggs. And in total, I understood as part of this, I would also need to design in a compost system to make sure that we had enough material to keep all of these garden beds producing. I designed a 10-year rotation plan to support this. My original rotation was focused on avoiding diseases that affect Solanaceae plants like tomatoes and potatoes, and it included 1 year planted to nothing but squash. I discovered this year that my local pest pressure for squash is just too high to grow all of these together in a bed as a monoculture, and I've decided to mix just a few of those squash into my summer beds and instead use that 10th year to leave the bed fallow and rebuild soil health with cover crops. Overall, this means that I need 10 annual beds to support the rotation, plus permanent designated spots for perennial crops like fruits and nuts, a chicken composting system including a combined shed and coop, and fencing around all of that to keep the deer out. I'm happy with the design. I don't feel as though I screwed that up too badly, but I definitely scaled it incorrectly. The thing about building out everything all at once is that there's a lot of time and physical effort required to build this infrastructure. It's going to land right on top of your core gardening tasks like starting seeds and planting, weeding, pruning, watering. And the thing is, you will not get it all done. You can convince yourself that you will, but I promise you won't. And second, you're going to end up doing much of this work in really lousy time windows, such as 95-degree days, or prime mosquito feeding hours, or a day that it's raining, or a day you really wanted to do something with your family. That will severely impact the level of enjoyment that you get from your garden, and I think in many cases could get somebody to quit altogether. Please, please don't repeat my mistake. In hindsight, this is how I should have thought about scaling up the system. The first year, I would recommend you only think about growing things for fresh eating. Your main goal here are to grow the things that have higher quality and nutrition when they're freshly picked and that tend to be kind of perishable. These also are the most expensive items in the grocery store, and if you focus on growing all of these, you'll get some immediate enjoyment, and you should see a reasonable impact on your grocery bill. The types of things that would fit this bill would be salad greens, peppers, herbs, and cherry tomatoes. Berries also are in this category, although they can be a little tricky because they're perennials. If you want to go with those, I would suggest starting with strawberries. They're a lower commitment because worst case, you can always grow the runners and put them in a different part of the garden in case you change your design. From there, in your second year or beyond, I would recommend expanding into what I call storage crops or staples. The goal here is to have more resilience and a higher portion of your food coming out of the garden all through the year. This one won't be as dramatic in terms of money savings because a lot of these tend to be pretty inexpensive. These are your root crops like potatoes or sweet potatoes, along with, for me, things like canned tomatoes. But if you can focus on growing the things that you eat in high volume, as well as things that store well, that will serve you well in terms of rounding out how much food you're getting out of your garden. Note that this says years 2+. You'll see when I do my detailed example at the end that I stretched this process out over a full 3 years, but in theory, you could just focus on doing this your second year. From there, once you really feel like you have your systems established, and so here I'm saying year 3 and beyond, is when I would start thinking about incorporating animal proteins. The goal with that is to get more of a complete diet more easily than you can with only plants. And for most of us living in the suburbs, that would stop at eggs. We're not, generally speaking, going to be raising our own meat. In theory, if you wanted to, you could bring in something like rabbits, if that was a goal of yours, but I personally am only planning on having eggs as well as the compost getting produced by the chickens. I already made a case for why you should do everything in phases in general, but there's a reason that I've structured it by these specific phases in particular, and that is that it allows you to focus on certain core skills that you're building as you go, really mastering those all together, and only then moving on into the next set of skills. Here's that same view, but now talking about the skills. That first year with fresh eating, you're really mastering core gardening skills. This would include seed starting, pruning, fertilizing, watering on the appropriate schedule, season extension to get a longer harvest through the colder months, as well as working on your rotation plan for the garden, pest management, time management, and dealing with things like cover crops. That's a lot, and really focusing on getting your core gardening skills down is candidly as much as you're probably going to want to do that first year. It also gives you time to really see what happens with your specific site conditions. What kind of pests are there? What do we personally eat? What kind of yield were we getting out of the garden on our soil with our climate? And overall, what did we really enjoy or really hate trying to grow? Moving on to year 2, when you've got some of your staple or your storage crops going on, this starts to be as much about managing food storage and preservation. Because the goal is to consume food from the garden for the full year, you're going to need to figure out how to can things, dehydrate things, freeze things, etc. As well as, with some of these crops, you're now putting kind of a point load on your system. You're growing one thing in large volume, and that can strain the soil health. You're going to need, during this phase, to really learn how to manage pests as well as your soil health with things like cover cropping. And some of these crops require new growing techniques. As an example, carrots can be really hard to get them to germinate. With potatoes, you need to hill them up. With sweet potatoes, you often have to grow them under specific tarps or covers. And all of that is a new skill. And then definitely don't underestimate the amount of work that comes into learning how to preserve foods. If you've never canned something or done root cellaring, you're going to want to give yourself a little bit of time and grace to figure that out. Last, year 3 or beyond, because again, you might want to stretch out that storage phase longer than 1 year. Think about animals, and in this case, your goal is really to make sure that you're providing humane care for these animals. They're going to need food, shelter, disease prevention, predator protection. You're going to need to manage their wastes and make sure you're not creating a system that's bad for the animals and bad for your neighbors. And overall, this comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility, much more so than you have for something like a plant. As part of this, you're also going to need to be sourcing what I would call carbonaceous material, things that can help with the waste management like straw, leaves, or wood chips. And you're going to need these things in bulk, large amounts, and establishing those relationships can take some time. The good news is, in the suburbs, we tend to have a lot of options to cue into things like free wood chips, our neighbors' leaves in bags, or restaurant scraps that could be used as extra food for the animals. The overall logic here is I think you should scale up the risk as you scale up your skills. So that first year of fresh eating, you're growing stuff in small amounts, and if you fail or something doesn't work, you can supplement from the grocery store, you can plant a different thing. It's really fairly low risk environment. When you get up into things like storage crops and you're growing a lot of something, if it then spoiled during storage or something went wrong with the crop or a big disease problem, if you introduced some kind of soil issue, all of those are a much bigger consequence, and it's nice to have more skills under your belt before you start taking those risks. And then last, with animals, I mean, this is a serious responsibility. You want to make sure that you have the time and the skills and all of the infrastructure in place to avoid creating an inhumane situation for a living creature. Staging this out and really allowing yourself to nail down certain foundational skills that then build on each other helps with the overall risk management, and frankly, it just keeps you from getting super stressed in the process. Here is the detailed, specific plan of how I should have built out this garden area. I'm going to walk through what I would do now if I were starting from scratch and if I were a typical suburban situation of converting lawn into a garden area. I really should have started with just 4 beds for fresh eating. In effect, that's actually how it worked out this year. I had 4 beds that I raised for fresh eating items, and then all of the other 6 either were left completely empty with just a black tarp over it, or I used them to grow cover crops. I also wasn't able to source enough wood chips, despite having a great arborist that is giving them to me occasionally for free. I just didn't get enough of them to cover all of the pathways or to manage the weeds in the way that I would have liked. After having lived with this now for a year, I would recommend that you start with 4 beds to give yourself enough space and room to do some meaningful crop rotations. I think just starting with 1 is too little. But if you started with those 4, and then you only added 2 more beds every year, it's a reasonable amount of work for you to do every fall, getting those 2 new beds done. And it means that you're more likely to have enough materials like leaves to start and then mulch the beds, plus enough wood chips on hand at any given moment to thoroughly cover the pathways. Here would be a view of the garden the first year. The beds that are grayed out aren't built, but I am mentally tracking what would in theory be grown into them to keep my rotation straight over time. So I'm showing all 10 beds, but only 4 of them are getting built this first year. The numbers in those grayed out beds tie to the rotation plan at the right, just to kind of track what would be in theory be in these beds. Moving to year 2, I've assumed here that I added 2 more beds at the end of year 1 in the fall, and that's shown in green. Plus, I then expanded my wood chip pathways around them, and then I follow a normal rotation. So as an example, what was growing in bed number 1 is now growing number 2, or sweet potatoes. What was growing number 5 is now growing number 6, etc. With 2 extra beds to work with, I've added in onions and sweet potatoes to the garden. Those are marked here in pale yellow. The reason I started with onions and sweet potatoes as the suggested storage crops to do first are that both of them have fairly simple storage requirements. They can just be root cellared, and both of them are fairly light on any kinds of disease issues. If you'd gone with something like potatoes or tomatoes, you would have to immediately learn how to do things like quickly cleaning up your crop residues, hot composting to destroy disease pathogens, and potentially canning. And adding all of that into your skill set at the same time is kind of a lot to expect out of yourself in just your second year of growing. I'm not showing, by the way, the perennials anywhere in this plan, but in theory, at this point in time, you could start building out beds for the perennials if you felt comfortable that your garden plan was on track and you knew what you were really going to be growing. If you were really ambitious, you could also start potentially building out things and structures for the animals if you wanted to tackle all of that in year 2. Just please don't try and do all of it in year 1. Showing year 3, again, I assumed that I added 2 more beds the prior fall and then planted them out in year 3. These are shown towards the south with green highlight. And as far as new crops, now I've got 2 more beds to work with. I've added in paste tomatoes and broccoli that then gets planted with garlic. The reason these came second is that garlic requires overwintering in place, and managing that would be a new skill for me. And then the paste tomatoes require canning when I do those in large batches, and that would also be a new skill, as well as at this point I'm putting in a point load of Solanaceae crops, and I really have to be careful with disease management and soil health. Looking now at the 4th year, at this point I would have built out all 10 beds and all of my wood chip pathways would be done. And these 2 final beds were added at the north end, shown those again in green. And I'm still following that same rotation. And the last 2 crops to get added in, shown in light yellow, are a bed of overwintering garlic that then gets planted with potatoes. Now potatoes require hilling up, which would be a new skill, and so it's nice to kind of add that later. I've also now hit the point where a bed can sit fallow for the season, and that would be my first time really focusing on incorporating intensive cover crops into the system and building soil health. From this point forward, I am just following the regular crop rotation. I'm not adding anything new. Here are years 5 and 6 side by side to drive that home. 3 starts growing 4, 8 starts growing 9, the fallow bed 10 becomes number 1, and the cycle just keeps repeating. At this point in time, I'd expect that my chicken composting system is well established, and I've got my perennials in place, and some of them may even be starting to produce. So overall, this is the garden kind of running at full clip. I hope the visuals were helpful for explaining that. It can seem a little complicated, but I promise it is totally doable. It just requires careful planning, and I really wish that I had approached it this way and not ended up with empty beds or weedy pathways, and really focused on biting off what I could chew in manageable chunks over time. Feel free to steal this rotation if it is helpful. Otherwise, just adapt this with the same principles to what it is that you want to grow over time and the skills that you think will take you the longest amount of time to master. I've got 3 final, basic, but extremely important tips that I learned in this last year that I highly recommend you take into account as you're scaling up your system. First, build your beds in early fall. It's the best time to convert sod into raised beds because you've got access to bagged leaves at the curb to use as the underlayer. And then things can stay in place and compost nicely over the winter for a nice planting bed come spring. Plus, if like mine, your local municipality has a free compost program for your residents, you'll have less competition from other gardeners for that compost because they tend to seek it out in the spring. Since it's the end of the season, you'll also be expanding your beds every year during a time when it's not that hot or busy, and it will be a much more pleasant time of year to get it done. Second tip, find a source for wood chips ASAP. You will use a ton of wood chips as pathway material, mulch for weed control, carbonaceous bedding, and to fill large perennial beds. I would suggest creating a chip drop account as soon as you can and requesting a delivery, and then also go into Google Maps and call up 2 or 3 local tree services in your area and ask them if they can give you wood chips the next time they have some. In my experience, they always say yes because it's a waste material for them and they don't want to pay for disposal. Establishing these relationships early And then figuring out where you can store large piles of wood chips is key, because they're going to come on an erratic schedule, often with short notice, and you may not be able to immediately move them where they're needed. Third and important, hold off a bit on perennials. Perennials take a while to produce, and it can be super tempting to just bring them in right away and get them established. I would suggest holding off for at least a year if you can. Just in this first year of the garden, I've changed the design considerably, including that year of leaving things fallow, etc. And at this point, because my perennial beds are built, I really can't change that. Once they're in place, they're in place. And second, they're expensive. Perennial plants are much more expensive than seeds or transplants for an annual, and you want to make sure you know that you've got your design locked down before you start buying these things. And then last, they often require different care. Pruning a perennial is very different than dealing with an annual, and something like an apple tree that's getting tall is really difficult to manage without special equipment. You want to make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into and that you have all of your systems in place and time management figured out before you tackle those guys in your plan. I'm very happy that I scaled up the garden. I'm still excited about growing things. Even with the stressful and kind of screwed up year we had, I am still getting a good yield and I'm still enthusiastic. That said, it would have been way better if I had scaled this up in the way that I just suggested that you try, and I strongly recommend that you think about the minimum amount that you can do on any given year and really allow yourself some time and some grace to get your systems in place and your learnings in place before you take everything on. You'll have a better result, and overall I think you will enjoy the garden a lot more. I will keep up with the series. I think the next couple will be about our hugelkultur beds, as well as an update on how those potato bags turned out. But until then, let me know if I didn't touch on anything here that you'd like to hear more about, and I will try and answer it in the comments. Thanks.